Well, there are two things. One, there's a debate about what's happening to religion in America. Our book is about the world, so it's possible for God to be back generally, and America to be becoming marginally less religious. I mean, going from 86% to 76%. It's a bit of a drop in terms of the number of people who say that they belong to specific Christian faiths in America. That's a drop, but by any other standard of country, it's a lot. And our book argues that if you look at China, you look at Asia, you look at Latin America, and you even look at Europe, you see God coming back in most places into personal lives, but everywhere into public lives. And so the two don't necessarily contradict each other like that. In terms of the numbers inside America, I think those are really interesting. Most of them we've gone through, if you look underneath the headline numbers, what seems to be happening is a two-phase thing. On the one hand, the people who were sort of not particularly fervent believers or non-believers are definitely pushing more towards atheism. On the other side, the people who are believers tend to be pushing more towards evangelicals, to Pentecostals, towards conservative versions of religion. And so to some extent you have a polarization between those two. And I think what's interesting about that is that possibly it means that religion, those people who imagine religion is going to disappear from politics in America, are in for a rude shock, because they've got both sides are going to care much more. And actually, to some extent, what seems to be happening in America is that the religious issue used to be the sort of Republican issue. Now it's becoming the Democrat issue as well. It's now about poverty, the environment, all those things as well. So that in terms of the overall numbers, there might be a little judder in America. It always goes in waves in America. I don't see any sign of America becoming a non-religious country. But the underlying force of what's driving American religion along has always been pluralism. It's been competition. And I actually see atheism as, I suppose, part of that competition. Well, it's hard to say. I think a particular thing recently would seem to be Bush. I mean, Bush took a lot of people who didn't really care that much about religion and turned them into quite sort of savage disbelievers. People who suddenly confronted with the idea of a theocracy, confronted with the idea of somebody who really wanted to seem to put the church right in the middle of American life. That actually persuaded, I think, quite a lot of people that actually God was, just get him out of the system. And you see that in the reception of people like Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and people like that. But I think what's also interesting about Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens is that they are, they're reacting to something. You don't write a book saying God is not great if you think you've won the argument. And what's really interesting from a big global perspective is, I think for most of the 20th century, the elite, the global elite, have always identified modernization with secularization. And America was seen as an outlier, a slightly strange thing, but in the end it would come in. And what's happening, and very much what our book is about, is you look around the world at the moment, the more modern lots of countries are becoming, the more religious they're getting. Go to, I went to Turkey, you go and see Ataturk. He totally believed in pulling Islam out of the system. Now very much you have the modern bourgeoisie, who are very much the people Ataturk wanted to create. They're the ones who are actually voting for the AK party. Go to India, you see exactly the same with the BJP. It's the modern people who Nehru desperately wanted to create. You actually have Nehru's grandson now saying some quite strong religious things. It's exactly those people who are voting for the BJP. Go to China. The book begins in China in a house church. The people in that house church were absolutely the modern China. They're stem cell scientists, they're professors, they're bankers, they're high-tech executives. And for them, evangelical Christianity is almost a sort of way to get ahead in the world. That's very much the way in which they see it. And so around the world, whether, this book is not a book saying God is good or God is bad or he exists or he doesn't. It's an examination of a phenomenon. And the phenomenon is that religion is back in the world. It's back in politics. It's back in public life. And that has good and bad consequences. There are plenty of good things to do with people having choice, but we also detail lots of stuff like wars of religion, the way that culture wars are going global. But that basically is the world you have to live with. You either run away from that, or else you can start dealing with it. We actually align modernity with pluralism. I think that's the big category mistake. Peter Berger, who's the great sort of sociologist of religion, who one time was a big supporter of the secularization thesis, arguably the most sort of, the biggest proponent of it. When he switched and suddenly said, look, actually pluralism is the modern thing, I think that's it. And that's what's the core of why we think an American model, loosely termed, is sweeping the world. People are choosing which religion to have. They're doing the same thing as Thomas Jefferson did. You know, they're looking at the Bible and cutting out the bits they don't like and saying, I want this and I want this and I'm going to change this. It's a much more individual thing. And the reason why that is relevant to politics and public life is if people are choosing their religion rather than just inheriting it, then that means that when they go into the voting booth, they go into work even, they're not going to leave it at home in the same way as they might have done before. It's the forces of progress are driving it. You look at globalization, you look at technology, you look at a lot of democracy. You know, you're giving these, when you give people the vote, strangely, a lot of religious people go and vote for religious parties. When you give people technology, strangely, it's the people who actually use it best are often people like the mega churches. They're very, very quick onto this. If you look at the way that that globalization spreads, I think globalization actually encourages the demand for religion in two ways. There's one group of people who think we want religion to be a sort of storm shelter. And you can see that quite a lot of that, particularly in the Islamic world, but you can also see it in rural Arkansas or rural India. You can see these people who think, the world's out there, it's a frightening, difficult place, and religion is a form of protection against it. By contrast, what we also identified, which I think is the sort of unappreciated bit, is that for lots of people, lots of up-and-coming people, you know, visit the megachurches of America, you don't see poor, downtrodden people there. You see smart, young suburbanites. They see this as a way to get ahead of other people. Very, very true in China, very, very true in Korea, very true in Latin America, where you see Pentecostalism spreading very quickly. And the one exception is Europe, which we can sort of come back to, which is a harder case to make this argument. But in all other areas of the world, for better or worse, you know, those things are being allied. And actually it's going with if that's the sort of demand side, there's a sort of deeper demand side, is actually, whether we like it or not, man seems to be a theotropic beast. You know, given the option to believe in God or some kind of afterlife or some kind of meaning, they will do so. And if you want the quintessential example of the sort of modern religion, it's your president. You know, look at Barack Obama. There is a man whose life he wasn't sure about it. He found meaning in a Chicago church. And what's interesting about Obama, I think, is that he is somebody who, once you take him onto the international stage, which he's obviously already on, but once you put that particular element of faith on the international stage, I think you're going to see a very different reaction to American religion than you had with George W. Bush. George W. Bush typified all the things that Europeans in particular found suspicious and wrong about American religion. He seemed very hard, very intolerant. It wasn't the same thing, but I think a lot of Europeans could identify with this clever, young, well-educated man looking for something more to life and discovering it in the church. I think it's any accident at all that the best-selling religious book is called The Purpose-Driven Life. That's the bit which is striking a chord with globalization. So that's all the demand side. That's why people are going for it. And there's just one last thing on it. There is now quite a lot of science, again, for better or worse, which shows that religious people are wealthier, healthier, and happier than non-religious people. So to that extent, it, quote unquote, works. And Dawkins is very interesting on that. But the other thing which is driving religion, if that's the demand side, is supply. And you have the spread of American-style competitive religion, where you make great efforts to make religion much easier. You make churches more comfortable, you use every form of modern technology, you embed it into people's lives. And you see that spreading into other religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam as well. And you see it spreading around the world. That's a very good question. That is the area where God is back is the hardest argument to prove. That said, I think on one side, it's clear. The extent there are two parts of this book. One is saying, here is the politics, they're going to be involving religion, and then there's also the basic fact of people perhaps becoming more religious generally. On the first bit, that works completely with Europe. I think political Europe has suddenly got religion back into the public square in a way that people, I thought, just assumed they banished it. That's partly because of the arrival of Islam in a big way. Suddenly, it's a big part of domestic politics in a variety of European countries. Sharia, headscarves, where exactly the line between mosque and state should be, what children should be taught, whether religious schools are a good idea or a bad idea. These are all issues which are suddenly floating back to the centre. You also see it, I think, a degree amongst the leaders. You have Blair, who famously said, we don't do God, or rather his spokesman did. Blair is now running a faith and politics institute. You have Gordon Brown, again, sort of quite a religiously inspired figure. Sarkozy wrote a book about it. You see the influence of all the East European countries. So within the political world, I have no doubt that the same kind of culture wars and stuff which have been part of the American world are going to be part of the European world in a different way, but certainly in a way that Europeans just never imagined possible. Whenever they've looked at American politics, it's always been the bit where they thought that's an abomination, it's not going to come here. Well, it is. So politics, yes, God is very much back in European politics. The difficult bit is God is back in terms of personal religiosity. There, I think the evidence is much more mixed. On the one hand, church attendance generally in most places, or the mainline churches, are still going down. Against that, I think you could argue that on the edge, things are beginning to happen. You can see Pentecostalism growing very fast in France. You can see, if you go to the East End of London, you see a multitude of different religions competing. 2 million Britons have been through something called the Alpha course, which is a sort of, I'm going to simplify massively, but a bit like the version of the purpose-driven life. There's a degree of change there, which just shows things are going. Adult confirmations is another change. Childhood confirmations going down. Adult ones, i.e. people older suddenly deciding I want to commit myself to the Anglican Church or whatever, those are actually going up. My guess is, over time, the same sort of forces which have been at work in America, as the European religious market gets sort of freer and easier and more competitive, they will work, i.e. that if you are a suburbanite in Bordeaux or Birmingham, England, you will have some of the same kind of reasons to drift towards religion, the same sort of search for meaning, the same, in some cases, same degree of storm shelter. All those things will combine in the same way as they do in Birmingham, Alabama, or wherever. There is too much similarity there for it not to swing back a bit. But no, we're not predicting that we're going to reach a stage, or certainly at any time soon, where 76% of Europeans immediately identify themselves as Christian. I think there is an element of truth in that, which the mega preachers don't, what we call the pastorpreneurs, they don't particularly like that aspect, but it has to be said. And Rick Warren's a very good sort of test case of this. Is actually, if you look at some of the messages they're delivering amongst this sort of cuddlier, nicer thing, they're still quite hard line on issues like abortion, gay marriage. Famously, Warren got into trouble with a lot of people prior to his gig at the Obama inauguration. I think that was may have been a surprise to some people around him, that he was suddenly seen as more intolerant, quote unquote, than people imagined. In the end, a lot of them, if you listen to what they actually teach, it's not quite fire and brimstone, but it's got a quite stern message underneath it. So I think there is that militating against it. We think that China will be the world's biggest Christian country relatively quickly, and we think it'll probably also be the world's biggest Muslim country, maybe a bit later, because Islam is also growing, particularly in the rural West. What I think is really interesting about China is, as I said, it's the up and coming people who are joining it. Does seem to be a slight religious split. The Catholics in general are doing better in the countryside. It's the evangelical, more sort of American style stuff, which is particularly imported by Koreans, but also by Americans and also by the Chinese themselves. That's what's really moving in the cities. What is interesting to me, because again, our book is an attempt to study this phenomenon, take people inside these house churches, show what they're like, but then ask the political questions that flow from that. And the readings you get from the regime are very contradictory on this. On the one hand, it says the regime is prepared to encourage these things. Hu Jintao has said really quite nice things about religion, even about Christianity, and there's some element of certainly Confucianism the regime is quite comfortable with, because they're looking, in a sense, for glue to bring this huge country together. The level of social dislocation in China is gigantic. There's 1 year, I think it's 1998, and I may have got it wrong, where the number of people moving from the countryside to the towns in just that 1 year is greater than the number of all the people who left Europe and came to America in the 100 years before 1920. So you have social dislocation on a gigantic level, and the regime are aware of that. They're currently having to deal with lots of economic problems, and they see religion, at least, as a potential piece of glue to hold that society together. That's the sort of good side. On the other side, they are inherently worried and suspicious about religion as a sort of incendiary force. Various people have told me that the figure who the regime particularly identifies as John Paul II. They think John Paul II, they give him perhaps a too great a role in the Soviet Union's downfall, but they see parallels there. There's also a famous Chinese rebellion in the 19th century, which was led by a Christian. You see all the evidence of the Falun Gong. All those things make them uneasy. And what's happening with the house churches, as they get bigger, they're already arguably the biggest NGO in China. As they get bigger, they're starting to add things like some nurseries and all those things. The one other absolutely brilliant thing about what's happening in China, which is not brilliant, but it's fascinating, is what the regime have been doing is the rules within China basically say, and the rules are complicated, but they sort of say when you get to 25 people, no meeting can go beyond 25 people without government approval. Well, you have 25 people in a house church. Once it gets to 27, 28, the church, because of that rule, is forced to split. And because it's forced to split, it grows. So immediately you get two groups of 12 who are out there looking for more people. So ironically, the very rules that Chinese have introduced turn out to be the very things that make the religion grow quite as fast as it does. And that I think is a big thing. Islam is a difficult issue. On the one hand, you have, the big question about Islam is will it have some version, and they hate this word, of sort of Reformation or Enlightenment or some version of that. And the kind of negative answer on that is it's extremely difficult, because if you look at the number of genuine kind of real reformers within Islam, the sort of people who Westerners rightly or wrongly might think of as reformers, the sort of people who might allow women to say much more during services, all that type of stuff, that's a tiny, tiny portion of the whole. And the main argument is, the reform tradition with Islam is actually, is arguing that you should look at things 300 years after the Prophet rather than at the Prophet's time. It's all based around quite elderly arguments. And there's additional structural reasons why Islam might find it difficult to move. One is that if you look at the Quran is the literal word of God. It is not like the Bible, which essentially is reportage, if you can debase it in that way. The Bible is a collection of stories about something, people describing what happened. It's much easier to reinterpret the Bible than it is to change the Quran. The Quran, most Muslims insist it has to be in Arabic because this is actually what he said. And it's much more difficult for religion to find ways in which to adapt to modernity that way. But secondly, also on top of that, they have the problem of who they were. Jesus Christ was a sort of form of social difficulty. He was an outcast, a bit of a. Somebody described him the other day as a sort of a community organizer, which I liked. He was causing trouble. Muhammad, by contrast, the Prophet was a rule giver. He was handing out laws about how you live. Again, that makes it harder to change. So for all those reasons, Islam is harder to change. Against that, look around the world. The bits of the book we look at. America is an area where you have a large amount of Muslims living actually very successfully. In Europe, again, you have people entering a pluralistic society and again doing pretty well. You have the experiments now of Turkey, and actually particularly Indonesia, I think, is really interesting. All those areas strike me as areas where Muslims will come back to the centre and say, look, we need to be more tolerant, at least, of other religions. I mean, if you have a system whereby anyone who converts away from Islam is immediately under, in some cases, under really severe punishment, that's really the acid test of the modernity of a religion, is how tolerant is it about people being able to choose what they want. And that's the bit which Islam finds particularly difficult. But within the main heartlands, there isn't much sign of change. But I would be quite optimistic, actually, about what in the end will come out of European Islam, and actually particularly what will come out of American Islam. And if you want a parallel, there is actually one, is that the Second Vatican Council was actually pushed particularly by an American Catholic who put across the idea, we've got to face up to what's happening around the world. And he went back to Rome and persuaded the then Pope to do it, and that's that there is some degree of precedent, but I'm not nobody should expect this to happen immediately. I think the most well, I think there's two bits. I think from the point of view of where is sort of faith taking off, I think China is fascinating. I think from the point of view of where is it dangerous, where do you actually see the repercussions of this beginning perhaps to cause real trouble? I would give the example of Africa, where to be very crude and basic about it, you have fundamentalist Islam pushing down, and you have evangelical Christianity pushing up. And in the book, I went to the front line in Nigeria between these two towns of Kano and Jos. It is that you drive along it, and that you will find mosques, church, and they battling almost all the way. And sadly, in many cases, actually, it does spill over into violence. 30,000 people have been killed, I think, in the last 20 years there. And to have these epic battles is quite normal. And it does have some degree of tribalness underneath. But the difficulty of religion is once it gets into a dispute, it makes it much, much harder to solve. The classic example being the Middle East and the Holy Land. When the Israeli-Palestinian thing was primarily a secular affair, which it certainly was to begin with, then it's easier to say, look, here's the border, we're divide it. Most people sort of know what the eventual solution is or should be. But actually, it's much, much harder to do it if both sides claim that God gave them the whole thing. Because once it involves fundamental truth as perceived, and you see it a bit with the life debate here, or life/abortion debate, it's the same thing. You cannot compromise. You cannot give way. I think the answer is you possibly can give way a bit more than people have done. You can see Hamas already talking about this idea of course, the land would always be Islam, but they'd be prepared to let Israel occupy it on a sort of temporary lease, which is a bizarre way of looking at it. But underneath it, there is a struggle, repeated struggle between religious people. Once religion gets back into politics, that makes a huge difference. And in many ways, what we're living through, I think, in terms of the world as we see it, is America has got one gigantic thing right. It's got the basic division of church and state, which both encourages religion and, on the other hand, provides a way in which religion can sort of foster within a political system. The bit which the Americans didn't get right was foreign policy. Whereas the Europeans, I think to be fair to them, were always much more scared about what was happening within religion, Americans just simply weren't. They didn't want to think. And this goes right the way through to Bush as well. Bush, it goes back earlier. You look back at Iran, when the Iranian Revolution was in preparation, somebody at the CIA produced a report saying, look, actually, there's a lot of religion in this, immediately dismissed as mere sociology, which is about as rude as you can get inside the CIA. When Hezbollah emerged, again, the American political establishment tried to see it in terms of left and right and where it worked with the Russians and so on. Its name is the Party of God. There was a basic refusal to see this as part of the argument. And actually, even going through Bush, despite all that sort of God-bothering aspect of Bush, Iraq, it took them a long time to understand the Sunni-Shia split. That was absolutely crucial. And again and again and again, you find these examples of people. I think American foreign policy establishment is still very secular in that respect. And now it's beginning to learn. And why is that important? Because you never, ever get solutions without bringing the sort of, quote unquote, people of faith into it. If you want it. One example where people have done that is Northern Ireland. People went out and they brought in people from both sides. You had priests, Catholic priests, Protestant rectors, sitting there, and each time there was an atrocity, both sides, they stood together and they condemned both sides. If there was a bomb in a Protestant area, it was condemned as well as in the Catholic area. Transpose the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, it happens occasionally, but virtually never. It's not like each time a rocket lands on a Palestinian house, a lot of people are killed. You do not see a rabbi and an imam standing together saying this is deplorable, nor do you see it when a suicide bomber goes the other way. And until you get that, it's going to be very, very difficult for a sort of lasting peace to come through. Benedict is an interesting figure to the extent that he seems to be interested in the idea of a kind of smaller, more vibrant, he perhaps if you use the word, more hardcore church. That seems to be what he's aiming for. And there's a concept which people use sometimes in talking about the European Union of a two-speed union, where you have an internal bit of, within the European Union, it'd be the French, the Germans, the Belgians, all kind of pushing together, total integration. And then you're going to have a second speed of people like the British who sort of like bits of the European Union but not the whole thing. And actually, if you apply that to Catholicism, and I know it's something of a stretch from one to the other, I think that's pretty much what Benedict seems to be aiming for. He definitely wants a sort of more evangelical, charismatic, and quite tough-minded Catholicism at the centre, and then he wants a variety of sort of fellow travellers around the outside. But his focus is going to be on that middle bit, I think. And you could argue that in the book we don't make judgments. Within the Economist we do. You could argue the stuff he said about contraception in Africa totally sort of fits that. I think there are two bits of that. I think religion, firstly, religion was doing pretty well before this crisis, so you could argue, maybe it's going to unseat it a bit. I suspect probably not. I think, I think actually, particularly perhaps in America, that element of suddenly kind of personal crisis, people losing their jobs, people being scared, that will, I think, probably drive people back to churches a bit. As I said, these things come in waves, and my suspicion is that one sort of big evangelical wave may just be cresting a bit. I don't know whether the economy in some ways will give it a little bit more legs. The other day I went to Saddleback Church, which is Rick Warren's one, and there was an event which they expected a sort of couple of hundred people to come to, instead of which a couple of thousand did. And I suspect there might be some element, we don't know, of depression economics at work there. People say that recessions are good for movie theatres and churches. That could yet be true. In terms of religion's role in causing the economic crash, I don't think even I can, even like all authors, I'm always desperate to tie things into my subject matter, but I can't quite do that. There is a big argument, which I think is very relevant to the modern sort of political situation, which goes something like this. When people look at forces like globalization and economics, there has been a presumption, particularly amongst the business community, that the world of the past 100 years, world of the past 25 years, the basic push of globalization, because it's got technology and it's got economic logic behind it, because it is, a billion people have been dragged out of poverty by this thing. This will continue. And yet, there are less rational things at work, and religion I think is one of those. That's where it fits in to me. It fits in the sense that people will not, in India, at the moment, India's got an election coming up, they will vote on the economy, but they will also vote on issues about how exactly you treat Islam, how exactly you deal with that. There are a lot of irrational things at work within politics, and that's what makes it very difficult for people who are purely technocrats to solve. And I think particularly in the business community, there is this presumption that if you have economic logic and technology on your side, or appear to, that in the end everything's going to be okay. And yes, that's what my suspicion is. Yes, it will be okay. But that's my sort of 60% bet, so to speak. But I think there's a sort of 30% chance that actually something stupid, political, emotional, perhaps including something to do with religion, will intervene. There are strange forces out there at the moment, and if you want to particularly, and I'm not predicting this is the same, look back at a lot of the literature before the First World War. People then just assume that even if there was a war, which most people totally assume there wouldn't be, that it wouldn't really affect this fantastic period of prosperity they'd had before. And in fact, actually, they then tumbled through out of the war eventually into you had the 20s, but then you had the horrors of the Depression. There are irrational things there. Peter Drucker, the management thinker, had a very nice line once that, whenever economic logic has confronted, I think it's politics and nationalism, it hasn't always been the former that's won. And I think it's in those cracks where things appear. What happens if Iran and America at the moment, there is a logical sort of compromise to make. if you're the mullahs in Iran. You gained a lot. Partly because of G.W. Bush, you have got a lot more power. What do you do with it? Do you cash in your chips? That would be the rational thing to do, but how rational are they? I think it's highly unlikely in the short term that the Democrats will become the party of evangelical Christianity. I think it is quite likely in the longer term that they will, in fact it's already happened. What's changed, if you look back at the difference between John Kerry and then Barack Obama and the sort of people around him, you had both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton very much trying to bring in quote-unquote people of faith, talking about their own religious experiences in a way that previous Democrats hadn't. There was a desperate effort to bring it in. And as I think you indicated, there are these issues. There's kind of creation care, as they call the environment. There's development, poverty around the world. That's an area where actually there's a lot of similarity, I think, between the sort of likes of Obama and Rick Warren. They're both looking at all these things. And I think there's two bits going on the religious right. There's the sort of birth of what some people call the new right, which is many ways a much more modern, still quite hard, still very hard line on abortion, still pretty hard line on gay marriage, but certainly has no wish to be seen as intolerant. Particularly young evangelicals, you get that very, very strongly. Even if they don't agree with gay marriage, they go out of their way to say they have gay friends or all that, which may sound, it's always the way that people, some kinds intolerant people try to explain things, but it is that it's very much along those lines. Within the Democratic side, I just think the levels to which you had Howard Dean running in, I think, 2000 to 2004, who put the Book of Job in the New Testament. Democrats used to be completely, utterly kind of Christophobic, I suppose, almost to use the word. Not obviously, Clinton, I think, was quite a religious man, but they didn't try to emanate that. I think now, Obama very strongly did. And that, I think, you need to do that, given the fact that most Americans, for better or worse, are religious. You need to give the impression that their values are somewhat closer to yours. And there are a lot of issues, like poverty, like the environment, where absolutely the Democrats are speaking to that. You're very unwise to take investment advice from me, seeing I was the man who invested in Eurotunnel, which was the attempt to go through. The Channel Tunnel did get built, but sadly investors didn't make money. I think in general terms, the way in which the economy is probably going to recover is going to be through sort of solid structural industries, things which people really need. That's pretty much always what happens when economies come back. And you've seen that this time, is that you've seen at some level whereby things like consumer goods and stuff like that, people still want to buy and don't see it as ridiculously expensive to buy Coca-Cola or washing powder or all those type of things. If I had to look for a kind of particular bit which I would imagine really coming back, I would focus actually on that sector which I alluded to a bit earlier. That there is 1 billion people who've been dragged out of absolute poverty into something which is a sort of middle class life. Now, maybe not by American standards, but certainly by the standards of India, China, Brazil, all those places. And those are the people who are just beginning to start to buy stuff. They're the ones who are buying scooters, if not perhaps cars. Maybe the Tata Nano is the first. Nano is the one which is going to bring people in. But on the whole, these are people who they're trying to invest in their children's education. They're trying to spend money on stuff, on clothes, on food, on more than just a subsistence level. They're actually trying to invest in what they're doing, and that, I think, is a broad class of people which, if companies who are aiming at them can do extremely well. I think the thing about globalization is its unevenness. People always assume it's a fact. It's not. As I said earlier, business people who assume globalization is just there and it's never going to go away should go and read history books very quickly, because the answer is it can get reversed. In the end, globalization relies on political decisions. It relies on tariffs being down. It relies on people and goods being able to cross borders. And just to give you a sort of frightening example, what happens if there is a dirty nuclear bomb in Delhi or there was Manhattan? What would that do to shipping stuff around the world. People will be far more paranoid. It's those sort of things which could yet unstable it. The underlying bits of globalization, I mean, I think you have to look at it as broadly as possible. I see globalization as a ever freer movement of goods, capital, people, but also ideas around the world, and that is generally why we are I hope a kind of great liberal newspaper. That is why we've always been sort of foursquare behind it. For us, it's economic freedom and individual freedom. They don't absolutely go together, but they come from the same source. I think there are lots of downsides in the sense of individual people who get caught out by this kind of often cruel process. A particular group of people who have always been vulnerable have tended to be the workers in richer countries who are more vulnerable to foreign competition. You shouldn't push that too hard. I mean, if you look at most things, there's been a lot of big arguments recently about wages in America. Why have wages in America kept down? And globalization is usually figured as the culprit. And that's, most of the evidence is no, it's not. The real thing which has kept wages down is technology. And the problem is that it's very hard for a politician to blame computers for people's jobs going or for pressure on wages. It's much easier to say it's the Chinese or the Indians, but again, look, just think through your life. Just think of the difference between banks when there were lots of tellers, and now the fact you have ATMs to go and get stuff. That had a colossal effect on the industry, far greater than say NAFTA, which I remember was sort of going through at roughly the same time. But NAFTA attracted all the headlines, and that's the problem with globalization. The basic economic logic of it is always disturbed by the politics of how it's pushed forward. Technology can also be used to snoop on you, to say where you're going, to collect your records, to decide even. I mean, difficult things of technology are all this stuff. Again, going back to some of the religion arguments, to do with cloning, to do with what knowing individual things about which genes you have and how you act upon them. That's going to be both liberating and also, in some cases, possibly frightening, and even in a sort of Machiavellian way, it could be frightening. So all that's going to go on. I mean, on the whole, technology poses problems, but there is never a bigger problem. The worst thing is always to try and oppose it. On the whole, technology should be let to push ahead. In terms of stuff I'm excited about at the moment, I mean, one particular thing which applies to our industry, if you want to look at the newspapers and magazines, and forgive me for the selfish aspect to it, is I think the whole aspect about how people will be reading and looking at newspapers and magazines in the future, I think is very interesting. You have devices like the Kindle, what exactly difference that will make. And technology does, it has a way of coming along and either solving problems or complicating them in a dramatic way. That there are huge things to do with healthcare as well going on, which I think are fascinating. But it's much better, I think, with technology just to accept it's coming, even if you're personally somewhat technologically inept, like I am. This stuff eventually comes through and changes the world. People want to get information quickly. They're much more likely to get it by quickly logging on, and in most cases not even having to log on. It just appears in front of them. Magazines so far have been immune to that, or relatively immune to that, because people read magazines sitting back. They're relaxed. And the question is whether the next generation of PDAs and things like that will be good enough to replicate that experience. Will we end up having a sort of version of a Kindle or a Sony reader which is sort of foldable or could fit in your pocket? I don't know. But those, I think, it's a good example of how technology could come along. One lot of technology comes along and disrupts an industry. Another lot of technology comes along and perhaps changes it for the better. That's true. We have a long special report coming out in The Economist all about healthcare and technology, where you for years, and it features one gentleman whose name I can't remember, but I think he's now 90. And 40 years ago, he was talking about how the way in which technology should completely transform healthcare. And look, where have we got to? You go to see your doctor. Most doctors still write down your information on a piece of paper. Each time you go to a new doctor, you have to re-enter the whole thing. Patient power is going to grow. There should be a pretty dramatic change, I think, in terms of when people have illnesses, they're beginning already to go to particular websites and picking up particular information. But already you're seeing signs of people beginning to mark doctors, saying how good are they at this, how good are they at that. And I think that beyond that, there's going to be the simple element of just having a lot of information about you out there, which causes some degree of privacy concerns. But on the other hand, makes life gigantically easier. If everyone had a card on them, which gave 95% of all their available medical information, that would actually make a dramatic difference in anything like accidents and all that type of stuff, because all the tests people now have to run pretty routinely, you wouldn't need. And also on top of that, you're going to get all the cross-disciplinary stuff. If you look at research into cancer, a lot of the stuff to do with cancer, the new thing which they're looking at cancer involves stem cells. Actually, what was interesting was that the possibly big breakthrough in cancer came not from people who were spending their entire time studying cancer, but actually from people who were looking at something slightly different. And so I think this cross-disciplinary aspect of people suddenly being able to jump from bit to bit, I think is very interesting. And a particular thing which I suppose worries me a bit is the degree of specialization we increasingly have in the world. People, particularly on the academic side, people tend to focus on a narrower thing. It's you're no longer an English literature professor. You are Jane Austen's latest 2 novels professor. That's what you specialize in. And some of that breadth, there's an interesting contradiction to my mind, at least looking from the outside, between the broadness is often where the bigger ideas are to be found, and yet the narrow specialization, you could argue back to Adam Smith, that people are being forced to go into, and it's the tension between those two things which I think is fascinating. The basic, so my thinking always changes about things, but in terms of the basic idea, the book was called The Company, A Short History of a Revolutionary Idea, and the basic idea behind it was that actually this boring institution, the company, the joint stock company, actually was a revolutionary technology. It took an idea about a way to run businesses, a way to be able to bring in outside capital, and above all the idea of limited liability. And that actually completely transformed the world. If you want an example, going back to what we originally said, when the joint stock company first appeared back in, I think, Elizabethan England, and then helped in many ways colonize America, at that precise time, you would argue that the Islamic world had much, much more advanced commercial structures than the Anglo-European world did. What happened, in fact, is that Islam got left behind, and one big reason for that was they were unable to come up with a structure, partly to do with actually reasons to do with religion and inheritance and stuff like that, which could actually deal with joint stock companies. And that made a big difference. So I think the company is still an amazing organization. What comes out of the current crisis about it is harder. I mean, you could argue that to some extent, when you looked at banks, the concept of limited liability hasn't gone right. I mean, it has been very limited liability for the people at the top of them. The full way in which capitalism was supposed to work, whereby people who did very well were then supposed to lose a huge amount when they went. It's true, people at the top of banks have lost quite a lot of money, but there's still a general feeling out there that that people have got a lot for nothing. And what intrigues me on that is a particular thing to do with the company. We argue is a revolutionary organisation, but it's always relied on some degree of a franchise from society. Whenever corporate capitalism is seen to go too far in some direction or another, there's usually, not always for the better, but there's always been some degree of backlash. There's always been some degree of, we want this back. And it's worth remembering, actually, companies exist because of the state. They exist because the state decides to give uniquely to a company the concept of limited liability. If you go bust or I go bust, then that's us personally. But a company has that ability just to keep all its debts within itself, and the people behind it not to be hit for the full bill. And that is a privilege given by the state. And although in general I'm much more frightened about there being far too much regulation after this particular episode we're still going through, there's a reason, at least conceptually, to imagine why people might want to re-examine that relationship. I think what Brown is really interested by at the moment is the global institutions. That's what he. You talk to Brown, he will argue, argues to me that Economist's great argument, in a great paper of constitutional reform, look at the global institutions and try and work out what you should do with them. And I think there is, he's onto something in one way, but there is an inherent tension in it, is that when you look at these organizations like the IMF and the World Bank and so on, there is an element whereby there's an immediate lack of concord between the two. On the one hand, you have global capitalism. On the other hand, you have much less impressive global institutions. And then you have this global crisis, and people immediately say, well, we want to have a bigger, a much more dramatic superstructure to rule the entire thing. You can see that at the G20 meeting where they bolstered the IMF, which I thought was a very good idea, particularly for the emerging world. But fundamentally, in terms of there being a global regulatory answer to this crisis, I just don't think that works. And the reason really is to do with America, is that this crisis began in America. It was, that was the absolute epicenter. So if you have any dreams of a global regulator running the world, you would have to imagine a system whereby the global regulator would be bossing around the treasury, bossing around, and that's just not going to happen. And so to some extent, it's an idea which theoretically has some degree of attraction, but actually, once you hit the practice of it, it's very difficult, partly because you just hit realpolitik. I cannot see any American president agreeing to have the IMF telling him what to do, or telling her what to do.